Curious. Yes, if you say the word Holodomor, the two things I'm going to think are, number one, why are you doing the CIA's job? And number two, do you condemn Churchill? Hello.
Hey, and welcome back.
Welcome back after an unexpected long sabbatical. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will, and this is Left Unread.
That's right. We are two dudes engaged in a radical self-education.
That's right. We're simply two modern-day Trotskyists in the modern gulag requesting an expansion of our library.
Don't you dare. And this episode, we are finishing our read of Losurdo's Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend. For this episode, we've read chapters 5 through 8.
Yeah, we're kicking off the new year with the return to what we ended last year with. That was a terrible way to say that, but we're back with Stalin.
Yeah, it was not planned that we were going to have a, 8-week hiatus between
a little
episodes.
bit of time.
Sorry about that, loyal listeners, but thank you for your patience. But yeah, we're just going to jump right back in. I think last go round, I guess I would characterize, and we were talking before, characterizing our reading of the book as certainly erring in the positive towards Stalin. I would say my attitude toward that hasn't shifted all of that much, but maybe it has a little for you.
Yeah, I don't know. We took that long break, and I spent that time doing a little extra reading. I mean, I finished up the books that I was reading on Stalin, primarily Conversations with Stalin. And I don't know, I just developed some interesting feelings about Stalin, more so as a person. My critiques don't stem from his actions as the leader of the Soviet Union necessarily, not that I agree with everything he did, but I don't know, I've been starting to think more of a structural critique in that sense. You know, like at the end of the day, I mean, Stalin died of old age, essentially. He had a stroke, but he died of old age, and by the time he was dead, he was pretty old. From some of the anecdotes I read, he was a little raunchy as well. And there's a question in my mind that's similar to the kinds of questions that we have about the U.S. today. You know, why do we have these systems in place that allow these older figures to essentially die in office? And when it comes to Stalin, the question I have there is like, really, shouldn't we expect more from our leaders? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, and that's ideal. That's idealistic in a sense, but I don't know. I actually don't know. Now that I've said it out loud, it doesn't feel as strong a point, because most of the argument that Losurdo is making throughout this book is that it wasn't a matter of choice or vibes or ideology even. It was a matter of the material circumstance. So like expecting better from our leaders doesn't change the fact that they have to react to these material conditions.
Yeah, I think that would largely be my response to that. But at the same time, one of the thoughts I've been kind of sitting with is just ideologically, I think as communists, we need to get away from great man theory in general.
Of course.
And the idea of lionizing a figure, regardless of how much we appreciate what they did for communist movement in their given context or whatever, is irrelevant. I just think we need to move away from that kind of adoration of a figure and look more critically, critically meaning like examining critically, not to be negative, not in a pejorative, but look more critically at the actions of a figure and not get so caught up in the figure themselves, with the asterisk that there is a line where you can't separate a figure from their action necessarily.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there are some figures Losurdo mentions in here that we might end up talking about in this episode, but there's a quote that I kind of want to talk about on 269 here.
Oh shit, going way in.
Well, yeah, and I think it just really sums up my feelings on this book as a whole so far. In this chapter, he's comparing the Katyn massacre, in which all the Polish officers were killed, to, other tragedies of soldiers in war, like in South Korea.
Yeah, this is right after Korea.
Yeah, in the Korean War. I mean, Nogunri was a horrible massacre. Listen to Blowback if you haven't. Sorry, I'll plug it anytime I can. But he says at the bottom, "Here it is not a question of establishing a hierarchy between two crimes that are both unjustifiable. It is instead a question of noting the inadequacy of the moral Manichean approach to understanding Stalin and the country he led." And that's just really the shift here, is that I'm still partially stuck in, a moralistic good and evil lens. It's hard to break out of that in the sense. It's something I've just had to do more and more as I study more history. It goes without being said, like, it's something that should be done. It's just hard to do sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, especially coming from the position that I come from, where I found my way to communism mostly through philosophy, which is very concerned with moralism, Which is why I always really like when we run into the work of philosophers in communist theory. Like, there's a bit with Kant in here that really got me thinking a lot about the universal utopian versus the concrete material. And I don't know, it's really hard to exercise yourself from that, to separate yourself from that. Not that I think Marxism is an amoral philosophy. You'll hear people say that, and I think that that's gibberish. I think that's dumb. But it is very difficult. I do know that it is very difficult to look at the actions of communists in history without scrutinizing it purely from a moral position. Because I think we often have that utopian universal in mind, as opposed to recognizing the concrete material that they're stuck in, they're mired in.
Right.
You know? And not that that's an excuse. And largely, you know, I this is sort of something we talked about in the last episode, but largely the way Losurdo frames his analysis of Stalin in this book is through comparison to other world leaders at the time. You know, Churchill's a perfect example. And Churchill was a piece of shit.
Yeah.
That's not a justification for Stalin's action.
Right.
To say like, well, Churchill did it too is not a moral justification. And it's really hard to get away from that kind of thinking. Not that I even think you have to. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I know what you're saying, and I was thinking about that a lot. I mean, there's that whole section where Losurdo brings up kind of the root analysis of Stalin, where they talk about his history and, you know, the kinds of underground revolutionary activity that they did, which was like bank robbery, train robbery. I mean, they were fucking cowboys, you know, doing that kind of heist shit. And then he brings up all of these things that Churchill did in his youth. I mean, like literally establishing labor camps and doing exterminating practices. And he's like, is it really any more edifying than Stalin's is in that sense? And it's that same thing. It's not that we're making a positive judgment of either. It's just that we're distancing one of them from a purely negative moral abstraction. You know what I mean? It's like you can't say this guy's good and this guy's bad based on their history, because both of their histories are dog shit. You know, it's just that, and this is a big caveat here, at the end of the day, there's an ideological backing to them. You know what I mean? It's like especially when it comes to the comparison to the Gulag and the concentration camp, right? The purpose of adding all of these other examples onto that is to differentiate the two. It's not to say that like, oh, everyone else was also doing it. That's why it's okay for the Gulag to exist.
Yeah.
It also displays that there is literally an ideological difference in the two. You know, just as we discussed on the last episode, how there's a difference between the rehabilitation, quote unquote, of the Gulag versus the extermination of the concentration camps.
Yeah.
It's like, why was this rough and tumble history of Stalin different from, say, Churchill's? Well, you know, in one sense, Stalin was working for a revolutionary project, right? He was doing these criminal activities, these amoral activities.
He's funding the Bolsheviks.
Yeah, for the purposes of proletarian liberation.
Yeah.
Right? On the flip side, when you look at someone like Churchill and you see all this same seedy shit in their background, you have to understand that it's in service of an imperial, capitalistic, exploitative project, you know? A system, an empire.
Yeah, there's a great quote on 197 where this is in the kind of twin monsters section where Losurdo is responding to the narrative of Hitler and Stalin as twin monsters. And he says there's a significant difference because, in fact, it was not scarcity of resources, but ideology that drove the liberal West to subject the Germans to death by starvation.
Yeah.
There is a big difference in that. The ideological intention to exterminate a people is very different.
Sure.
I guess maybe we'll get into that when we talk about the Holodomor here a little bit, but
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, I guess my mind, I feel like I'm all over the place and we haven't even really gotten into the text, but this idea that the ideology behind something changes the way you have to interpret the action. Like bank robbery, as an example, okay, maybe you could argue that bank robbery is inherently bad. Kant certainly would, as a deontological philosopher, but I wouldn't, because the ideology behind why it is happening and what it is being used for makes a difference in my moral estimation, right?
Sure.
And I'm thinking a lot about the same thing with like nonviolence. This is why I'm not a pacifist anymore. You know what I mean? Like ideally, violence would never be necessary, but violence is currently monopolized by one group with a specific ideological purpose of subjugation. To use violence in one's liberation is not the same thing. It's like a false equivalency, right? And I think like a lot of the comparisons of Stalin as a figure in history, looking at his action compared to similar actions from other world leaders, I kind of come away with the same conclusion, which is largely that like, yeah, it's not great that Stalin did that, right? But there is a significant difference.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like we're talking very broadly.
Well,
maybe we should get into some more specificity.
I think that's fair. Just to kind of round off the thought, it's hard when you get into the weeds of things because the devil's in the details. I don't know. But, here we're literally doing the thing right now where we're losing the concrete in the universal,
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. I don't know. Let's break into it.
Yeah, I will say my reading of these last 4 chapters, most of my notes come from 5 and 6. 7 and 8, I don't have a lot to say about. Other than maybe some Pol Pot discussion.
Some Pol Pot discourse inbound. Just trigger warning, there's Pol Pot on this episode.
Yeah.
I really started to feel it was starting to feel like it was dragging a little towards the end. A lot of the same points,
Yeah, it just felt like more of the same.
Yeah, and that's fine. There were a lot of things I think we were looking forward to. Like, I know you were interested specifically in some rebuttal to the Holodomor, or not necessarily rebuttal, but more exploration, I suppose.
More context, yeah.
Yeah, and that really doesn't happen in the same way in these chapters. I also, over our long holiday break, I also saw a lot of discourse on Twitter that Losurdo is shit, and I was like, I've never heard that before.
I thought everyone loves his imperialism book.
I have no idea, and I don't know, and this is a consequence of me just being in the middle of a billion different random communist circles on Twitter. So take that with a grain of salt, obviously. I said this on the last episode. The relationship between the Soviet Union and Israel is an insane one. It is really expanded on in these 4 chapters, but at the same time, I don't really care. You know what I mean? Like, it's within the historical context of the Zionist movement, the Holocaust, and everything after that. And I think that the most important thing about that relationship is the least mystifying thing about it. And it's that after 1967, Israel is aligned with the West. That's it, So does it really matter to me all that much that Stalin was like a pivotal, according to Losurdo, a decisive figure in the creation of Israel?
No Israel without Stalin, he says.
Which is wild, but I believe it to an extent.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly makes the case that the USSR was pivotal in the creation and support of Israel, giving them arms in their fight against...
They sent Czechoslovak arms to Israel.
Yeah, maybe that's what I'm thinking of, yeah.
Which... Here's a historical fun fact. They sent Czechoslovak arms to many people. That was a titan of the arms industry, and basically their biggest global export was arms for a long while because they were pretty good at making guns.
Yeah.
I think the topics are good. The Twin Monsters is certainly something that we said we were going to talk about this episode.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, anytime you talk about Stalin with anyone in the United States that has never read anything about Stalin and only knows what their 10th grade history teacher taught them in high school, they're going to talk to you about the non-aggression pact with Germany, and they're going to compare Stalin to Hitler. And Losurdo devotes quite a lot of space to why that is a ludicrous position and kind of his context around the justification for the non-aggression pact with Germany. That's all interesting to me. So let's jump in.
Yeah.
The first thing with the non-aggression pact that I have marked is on 182, 183.
Okay.
So he's talking about Czechoslovakia here. Losurdo is talking about Czechoslovakia, and he says on 182, Czechoslovakia, from having been a dagger pointed to the heart of Germany, is now rapidly being organized as a dagger into Russian vitals. And he continues on the page to say that the Nazi fascist aggressors successively devoured Ethiopia, Spain, Czechoslovakia, Albania, and China in Asia, thanks to the direct complicity or passivity of the Western powers, who were inclined to direct their further ambitions and expansionist aims of the Third Reich toward the country that had emerged from the October Revolution. So on one front, you have the USSR defending themselves against a power that is overwhelmingly taking over other countries and is being passively supported by the West, according to Losurdo. And then to the east, the Soviet Union felt the pressure exerted by Japan on those frontiers. The danger of invasion and war was thus arriving on 2 fronts. And it was only at this point that Moscow began to move the direction of the non-aggression pact with Germany, taking note of the failure of the Popular Front policy. And then to continue on the next page on 183, at this point the USSR had no choice but the pact with Germany, a move that has been defined as a last-minute dramatic improvisation to which Moscow resorted in the absence of any other alternative on the very eve of a new European war. This is not something that was, and let me interrupt my own thought. So it's last minute decision that is obviously like a Hail Mary kind of throw to try to prevent this war because they were vulnerable on two fronts. And it was uneasy for every second that they had that pact.
Yeah.
And that is well documented in the chapter.
Yes.
So, like, the characterization of this idea of Hitler and Stalin as best buds because of the non-aggression pact, or that Stalin was somehow endorsing the behavior of Germany under the Nazis, is just like smooth brain shit.
Yeah. Losurdo talks about in 1935, right? Paris and Britain both reject the Pact of Collective Security that was, I guess, put forth by Molotov, I think he says. And, like, that's 4 years before Poland is invaded. So, you know, there's ways in which you can see the West really acting in favor of Germany, in a sense. You know, it's only as Hitler's expansion becomes more and more threatening to Britain and France do you see those attitudes change of the West to become more favorable and more allied to the Soviet Union, you know? And then when Barbarossa happens, Churchill's like, oh, splendid defense, you know? But, I mean, their actions leading up into that point don't say, you know, we're buddy-buddy. They say quite the opposite, in fact. I mean, that's the whole thing that's happening in Czechoslovakia. I don't know if you know the World War II history there, but...
I know basically nothing.
Pretty fucked up, guys. Pretty fucked up. Go read the Wikipedia page if you haven't. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, right? Germany says, hey, the Sudetenland, the area around the kind of border of the tip of Czechoslovakia, that's all full of Germans and we're taking it. Mm-hmm. And then the rest of the world said, yeah,
go for it.
Yep. And then at the London conference, Germany said, we're going to take the rest of Czechoslovakia and we're going to make Slovakia. And the world said, okay. That's when Chamberlain said, oh, peace for our time, because that was, you know, the end of Hitler's expansion, clearly.
Yeah, obviously.
And then the rest of the war happened. So, you know, the interesting thing to note there is that, I mean, obviously Czechoslovakia was not thrilled about that decision. And the only people that supported them diplomatically were the Soviets. There is the issue of how do you get troops from the USSR into Czechoslovakia, and that was kind of the main thing stopping their support. You know what I mean? Because between them was like Romania, Hungary, Poland.
Yeah.
So if you look at Molotov-Ribbentrop in isolation, yeah, I'm sure you can believe the tales spun in your textbook. But I think if you look at any other span of time surrounding World War II, it's quite harder to argue that.
Yeah, and it's evident, and Losurdo points at quite a few examples of how tenuous it was and how basically it was all a facade. And both sides, both parties knew that it was kind of at its breaking point from its inception, and any single move was going to see it all crumble.
Yeah, I mean, in Mein Kampf, Hitler talks about how his hatred of Bolshevism and his desire to take Russia was informing his entire political movement.
Yeah.
And that was in Mein Kampf, y'all. I mean, like, this was written in paper. Like, he said this thing aloud. I mean, even on the next page, you know, I love this quote. On 187, Goebbels notes in his diary, the Fuhrer himself wrote to Mussolini, quote, I feel at peace with myself. The anguish and feeling of a disavowal of my origins, of my thinking, and of the commitments I had undertaken, the feelings that had accompanied the non-aggression pact had vanished, right? Hitler was clearly not thrilled. I mean, there's that other anecdote from I think it's from Canaris's diary, where he says that the Russians have been so accommodating in our non-aggression pact, we've been scrambling for a cautious belli. You know, they've been looking for an excuse to invade.
Yeah.
But don't let that fool you, because that might sound like, you know, they were accommodating. But Losurdo does a ton of work to show that the Soviets were mounting German resistance all over occupied Europe and in their own country from as far back as like 1939. You know, even on the page before, this is a conversation on November 25th, 1940, between Dimitrov and Molotov, where Dimitrov says, we're following a course of action to break up German occupation troops in various countries, and without shouting it, we need to intensify those operations further. Will that not interfere with Soviet policy? And then Molotov says, that is of course what we must do. We would not be communists if we were not following such a course. Only it must be done quietly. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know, y'all. Read a fucking book.
Yeah. I just think the Twin Monsters narrative is such a dog shit argument. I at least wanted to point out a couple of quotes from that part of the book, because, I don't know, it's just so easily dismissed.
The thing is that, who does it serve? I mean, all of this stuff, it's not that there isn't history here. It's just that it is directed in a way that serves the interests of empire. It's not that I don't want to talk about the Holodomor, quote unquote. I think that it's quite interesting to talk about famine. I think it's quite interesting to talk about the logistical challenges of collectivization in post-revolutionary Russia. But framing it as like the Holodomor serves a purpose. It's a twin Holocaust narrative, you know, and it's meant to downplay the Holocaust. You're doing the fascist bidding. I don't care how well intentioned you are, right? Framing it that way, you're not just asking questions. It's like you're asking the CIA's questions.
Yeah, so let's get into Ukraine a little bit. Let's talk about the Holodomor, because that is part of the twin monster narrative, like you said, the twin Holocaust narrative, this idea that what Hitler did to the Jews, Stalin did to Ukraine, and that's also dog shit. Now, I will say, I came into this knowing a little about the history of collectivization in Ukraine and all of the problems that wrought. So I was hoping to get some stuff that I don't think the book addressed very clearly. There's not enough about the 25,000ers. I want to know more about that. And I want to know more about the kulaks and the resistance that the kulaks led against collectivization, where they're burning silos of grain, and somehow Stalin is the one that's getting the fucking blame for Ukrainians starving. Like, I don't know. So I wanted that. It's not in there. That's unfortunate. But there is a lot of stuff about Ukraine and the Holodomor here that we should talk about.
Yeah, to put it broadly, Losurdo's argument against the Holodomor is that
it wasn't planned.
Famines were all over the place at the time. It's a question of motive. We don't have a clear evidence that Stalin's motive was to annihilate Ukraine as a nationality. In fact, quite the opposite. If you look at the Soviets' policies of Ukrainianization, of their industrialization, even of looking on 192, together with the action to destroy any Ukrainian separatist ambition, we see a policy of valorization of Ukrainian national characteristics, which sought to attract the Ukrainians of Poland towards a possible and hoped-for union with those of the USSR. Yeah. So, maybe there's some geopolitical strategy at play there, but the point is still that they wanted a union with Ukraine, right? They wanted an autonomous, strong Ukraine that would be part of the Soviet Union. And it's also not to mention that Ukraine was a huge part of the Red Army. It was a huge part of the Soviet economy. It was the breadbasket, right? That's where so much of the agricultural produce of the Soviet Union came from. Mm-hmm. And if you want to take it all the way to the end, right, they were such a huge factor that they were like the driving force behind the dissolution of the empire. When Yeltsin sought to illegally dissolve the empire, that's the person he did it with, was the secretary of the Ukrainian party. And then maybe the Kazakhstani guy,
Kazakhstan.
It was those three, and they kind of pushed it on through.
Yes, Losurdo's points, as you said, there was no planned character of what happened in Ukraine. Stalin was pretty much from the get, read the receipts, arguing for a positive national character, the valorization of the national character of Ukraine. And additionally, I think his third point is that the severity of the famine is overstated. I think those are kind of the three legs that his argument takes. And yeah, you already read the one quote on 192. There is another one on 194. There's some more on 194 about Stalin's affirmation of Ukrainian nationality, of the nationhood of Ukraine. It says, "We are familiar with the policy of affirmative action promoted by the Soviet power towards national minorities in the Ukrainian brothers and comrades," direct quote, to borrow the words used by Stalin immediately after the October Revolution. In 1921, he rejected the thesis of those who claimed that the Ukrainian Republic and the Ukrainian nation were inventions of the Germans. It is obvious, however, that there is a Ukrainian nation, and it is the duty of the communists to develop its culture. And then lastly there, it must also be borne in mind the development of the Ukrainian industrial infrastructure on whose necessity Stalin once again insisted. And the other thing I'll say on that matter is this. As we know, Trotsky was Ukrainian, and he was Stalin's number one op. And the fact that Trotsky contemporaneously is not writing about this as something that is planned by Stalin is, I think, like a huge tell. That it's clearly a narrative that was built in hindsight to try to paint Stalin as a monster.
Totally. And I mean, I skipped this quote because I thought it was after, but on 191, Losurdo really lays out the root cause, like the roots, where this Holodomor myth really comes from, right? He says, even his we're talking about Robert Conquest here, who's a total Cold Warrior historian, real piece of shit.
Cold Warrior?
Yeah, Cold Warrior.
I don't know that.
What? Yes. Even his admirers acknowledge a point that is not without significance. Conquest is, quote, a veteran of the Cold War and wrote his book as a part of a, quote, political cultural operation that was ultimately directed by U.S. President Ronald Reagan and that bore, quote, numerous fruits. On the one hand, by making an important impact on the international debate about the value and limits of Gorbachev's reforms, and on the other, through the stance of the U.S. Congress by powerfully influencing the radicalization of Ukraine's independence. I just said that Ukraine was a major factor in the dissolution of the Soviet Union, What do you know? What do you know? What perfect timing for the Holodomor myth to reach the popular critical mass, right at the point at which Ukrainian separatism led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. How interesting is that? Curious that we still hold on to this myth.
Curious. Yes, if you say the word Holodomor, the two things I'm going to think are, number one, why are you doing the CIA's job? And number two, do you condemn Churchill? I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so, I don't know. It's not a satisfying answer to the Holodomor question. I think that there are other things to read for that. Not that I think that necessarily I want to read for the podcast. Like, there's one in mind that's Fraud, Famine, and Fascism is like a classically held out study about how a lot of the Holodomor statistics comes from Nazi sources, how it's used to, like I said, prop up that dual Holocaust narrative. I mean, last year I read Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, which sucked mega shit. I was really interested mostly in the partition of Poland because that's such an interesting thing, right? That's a real source of soreness for the Soviets in the historical mind, in the, what am I saying, in the historical imagination. I mean, that's where the Katyn massacre happened, right? So, like, there is something to be said about after Molotov-Ribbentrop, Poland is occupied, Eastern Poland, right? The Baltic states are occupied, although Stalin, in one of his speeches in the Baltics, very clearly states that the Germans are about to attack. Mm-hmm. But something that really frustrated me about reading that book is that it's very clearly saying, like, oh yeah, Hitler was bad, but nothing like Stalin, you know? He started earlier, he did it worse. And that shit really sucks. So fuck you, Timothy Snyder.
Side note, are you watching Pluribus?
I am. I have. I finished the first season.
I've only watched the first 3 episodes. We've only watched the first 3 episodes. And I went into it having already seen, I started it late, and I went into it having already seen some discourse from communists online being annoyed. So I was waiting for this to happen. But there's a bit where Rhea Seehorn is
killed more people than
not
Stalin.
Since Stalin. Yeah. And I was like, oh, fuck you, man. Yeah. But what's funny is that I think there's almost a very pro-communist message under the surface of Pluribus. I haven't watched it all, so, you know, maybe it shifts.
I don't know. I think that there is I think that there's interesting discussion about Pluribus, and the problem is that any discussion being had now will certainly be undone by whatever Vince Gilligan decides to put in season 2.
Yeah.
You know? And no,
I'm so traumatized by Severance. The first season was so fucking good, and everyone started glazing the second season, and it's fucking dog shit. It ruins everything.
Carissa was really angry at the end of Severance. I was not so much angry because I'm happy for a cliffhanger every now and then. I can't lie. Yeah, it sucks, but I want to see what happens next. I know that's what they wanted. Pluribus, I feel the same about. There's something very interesting about the collective. The thing that ultimately will determine my feelings of that is, what is the purpose?
Yeah.
That's the philosophical question there, right? Like, say everyone were to be assimilated, then what would everyone do? Right now, their purpose is to keep themselves alive and assimilate these 12 people. So what would the goal be afterwards? And the thing is that that's something that will be written in a script, not done by anything ideological. You know what I mean, though.
Yeah. Sorry for the tangent. It's pretty clear through Losurdo's argument that collectivization, for all of the negative things that happened due to collectivization in the USSR, that no one is denying that, including Losurdo, that it was a necessary part of winning the war against the Nazis. There's a quote in here that I can't remember off the top of my head that is effectively like, without collectivization, the war would have been lost.
I definitely saw it earlier this morning when I was looking at my stuff.
Yeah, I can't remember where it was, but like, we're back to this fucking utopian universal versus concrete material.
Yeah.
Like, the reality is that collectivization was not ideal, but it was necessary to win the war. And that's not a truth that anyone feels good to utter, because you're saying some people had to die so everyone else could live. You know what I'm saying? But there is reality in that you just have to face. The other side of that is, if they hadn't collectivized and they lost the war, what was going to happen to all the Ukrainians in that case when Germany fucking invaded, you know?
I mean, like, there's a total alternate history that could unfold, you know? And this is always the problem with all history, because the history is written. But like, I don't even want to play this game, but like, just imagine that the Soviets didn't exist. Losurdo puts out the possibility of what Hitler's original Aryan ideal was: 2 great Germanic empires, one from Britain, one from Germany. And he lays it out very historically, I think. I mean, I think he does something historically materialistic here, where he's saying, it's from the very get-go. He says, you know, in the beginning, right, that expansion is partially inspired by the fact that Germany was unable to establish a colonial empire. After World War I, all of their overseas colonies were essentially taken from them, which they lost the war, so fuck them. And so he says that Hitler signs the naval treaty with Britain and all the Western powers, mind you, Japan even, because he's acceding naval dominance. He's saying, you guys can be the naval colonial empire and we'll do our colonization on land. So there is that, it's a possibility, of the two Aryan empires. The thing that prevents that from happening is the fact that the Soviets exist. There is a force to the east of Europe that is, it undercuts any of these capitalistic notions from happening. It prevents a long-term possibility of this thing because it is simply there in opposition. You know what I mean? So I don't want to do that whole all history thing, but the Soviets were there and they were pivotal. They were critical. They were the essentially defining historical force in that time because the world was reacting to them. That's really how it feels reading some of this stuff.
Yeah, that's well said.
I'm of the opinion that famine is always a political failure. I think Mike Davis really did a lot to convince me of that in Late Victorian Holocaust, which is actually mentioned on page 176. And so I think that there is interesting study to be had there. But I think that framing it in the context of the Holodomor only serves one purpose, and that's the West's purpose.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I'm happy to leave it. If you really feel passionate about the Ukrainian famine in the 20s and you want to talk to it, or you have recommendations on reading, you can definitely let us know at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. Don't think that we're minimizing the consequences of famine. That's something that's present in many communist situations, unfortunately.
Certainly.
But we're not talking about it in the context of the Holodomor. That's fucking for sure.
Yeah.
All right.
Do you want to talk about anti-Semitism?
I do and I don't. I think that it's kind of the same feeling, A lot of the anti-Semitism critique, it's twofold, There's part of it which does come from Russia's own history, Russia's relationship with Jews, Eastern Europe's relationship with Jews, and Russia's relationship with Israel. All of those things are important, and all of those things are real. The other side of it is the fact that it's a cudgel, Stalin's anti-Semitism is used to attack the Soviet Union. That's really it, It's even happening in the books that I've read before. It's really funny that Losurdo has that whole section about cosmopolitanism because there's a previous episode where I said that anytime they say cosmopolitan, they mean Jewish. And that's because that's what I had read, And so it's just interesting to recontextualize that because I really don't know the situation of a lot of Jews in the Soviet Union. I don't know. It seems like a very strange relationship, but it also seems interwoven with the historical plight of the Jews. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's something that I was struggling with while I was reading through this, because what's so interesting, I don't want it to sound like positive, but something that really stayed with me while reading about anti-Semitism in the USSR and in Stalin in general is that Stalin has such a long published history that it's interesting to see the way he talked about the plight of the Jews in his youth, and then to see his action and the way he talked about the plight of the Jews in the USSR later in life, And there's a weird, maybe it's just born in me as a skeptic and a person that doesn't trust anyone in political power, but any shift in the way one speaks about things like that, I start to get skeptical that it's being too politicized. You know what I mean? It's being wielded as a weapon or as a cudgel, like you said. And I don't know. I don't know exactly how to reckon with that, because it's very clear that young Stalin, coming from a position before the Bolshevik Revolution, before the October Revolution, where there was already rampant anti-Semitism all over Russia, was, as a leading figure of the Bolsheviks, speaking about anti-Semitism as something to fight against, and something that communism would be responding to.
He praises Karl Kautsky as a good social democrat because he polemicizes against pogroms in Russia, in Tsarist Russia, which I thought was really funny.
Yeah, but then it's hard to reconcile that with some of the accusations of anti-Semitism for him later in life. And then there's even nuance with that because it's a fucking open secret that the U.S. was trying to assassinate Stalin, just much like they did Castro and Lumumba. And it's is Stalin being skeptical of his doctors anti-Semitic?
Dude.
Or is it earned?
Oh my God. It's so funny when Losurdo's treatment of the doctor's trial where he says it just shows that Stalin entrusted his health to Jewish people. That cracks me up so much because it seems like such a silly argument.
Yeah.
I think that it's going back to that thing where you have to separate the personal from the political here because in those anecdotes I read from Gilas, Stalin is he's cracking sly jokes. He's like, do you guys have a lot of Jews on your high command or whatever when he's talking to the Yugoslav group? Regardless of Stalin's personal attitudes, I think that part of the reason that Losurdo talks so much about Israel here is because his political actions show support for Jewish people and their self-determination. I mean, I think that's why so much of Stalin's decisive role in Israel is brought up here, because his actions show that he looks at the Jewish ethnic group the same way he looks at any other ethnic group, as a group of people that is deserving of self-determination.
Yeah, worthy of
Yes. Yeah. And you can see that in his actions, right? Now, there is a part of me that wonders how much of that willingness to move Jews out of the Soviet Union into Israel was similar to the deportations of Jews in Nazi Germany, right? Just to get rid of them. Mm-hmm. That was a big impetus of the Zionist project originally. Yeah, we're happy to let you guys have a homeland so you'll get the fuck out of our country.
Yeah.
Back in the 1800s when the Zionist project was founded, essentially, that was why they got a lot of Western support, because people were happy to get rid of their Jews. If it meant somewhere where you could send them, then they would, right? But at the same time, there's an interesting thing that Losurdo brings up here, and it's the fact that so much of the Jewish population of the Soviet Union was in their fucking high command,
I have a quote for that, yeah.
Yeah, I keep saying high command like it's the military, but, I mean their committee, their
leadership.
Yes, thank you.
On 235, acknowledging the presence of Jews in leadership positions in Stalin's USSR and in the socialist camp directed by him means admitting that in those countries, access to power and social and political position were determined not by immutable racial affiliation, but by changing political behavior. Anti-Semitism to be transformed into a category capable of resisting and debunking by means of empirical analysis and thereby susceptible of application not only to Stalin, but also to the entire history of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Read the receipts. There were Russian Jews in leadership positions throughout the entire history of the USSR. And that is relevant, especially in the context of some other stuff that Losurdo brings up here, even back on 214, the U.S.'s unwillingness to denounce Nazi anti-Semitism.
Dude.
This quote is crazy. That is to say, while launching an impassioned appeal for national unity in the Great Patriotic War against the invaders like Kirov, Stalin also branded the Nazi regime as the continuation in some essential aspects of the Tsarism that was overthrown by the October Revolution. This attitude is all the more worthy of attention if one compares it with that taken by the American president and his collaborators who were hesitant to criticize publicly Hitler's anti-Semitic policies.
Yeah, I mean, what was that? I don't remember the name of the fucking boat. There was a refugee boat with a bunch of Jews on it that got turned away from the U.S.
Editor's note. I realized in hindsight Will was talking about the St. Louis, the famous St. Louis voyage. Okay, bye.
Right. Look at the policy at the time. And another example that Losurdo gives that I really appreciated, just to show how not black and white the situation was, is the situation in Hungary post-World War II, right? Reminder that Hungary was part of the Axis. They participated in the Holocaust. Right here, it's on 225, right? Stalin, Israel, and the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe. The conflict was not long in its coming. Should Jews returning to Hungary who had managed to escape the genocidal politics of the Third Reich and its thugs engage in the rebuilding of the destroyed country, or immigrate instead to the Jewish state? In the block quote, it says, "It was said then that the Zionists had a more extensive and efficient organization than the Hungarian communists themselves. 1/5 of the Jewish population took the immigration route. On the other hand," this is on the next page in the block quote, "the regime offered them political positions that Jews had never held before. They could become judges, officials, enter the government. The communist movement was quite weak and needed many cadres. How could the Jews resist the temptation?" So it's in two ways, right? Jews were put into positions of power in countries where they had previously been executed, and at the same time, they had to deal with that brain drain of that immigration of Jewish people from Eastern Europe into Israel. It's a very strange push and pull that I think really shows a lot of how the anti-Semitism in the USSR and Eastern Europe as well isn't as black and white as the West would have you believe.
Yeah, for sure. Losurdo goes on an interesting bit here about the U.S. propaganda around Judaism and its connection to communism that I just think is very ironic because of the connection in the U.S.'s anti-communist narrative. They're doing a lot of connecting Judaism to communism in a very obviously pejorative way. And it's an interesting counterpoint to someone like Trotsky calling Stalin an anti-Semite. This idea that somehow the U.S.'s narrative is that there's a connection between communism and Judaism, and Trotsky's narrative that the leader of the communist movement in the USSR is an anti-Semite. There's just a really interesting, almost dialectical approach to that. It's just funny. I don't know.
It's always a double standard in the history books. That's the thing. Like, I'm thinking even of when he says that, how funny is it to think of all the great purge trials as show trials and then to take gold in Khrushchev's denunciation? You know, it's like you can look at the records and see Stalin's support for Israel, but then at the same time it's wielded that he's an anti-Semite. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I don't know. It's just that strange double standard. And I think that at the end of the day, it's only held up, like I said, as a cudgel. You know, I think that it's a weapon.
Yeah.
Because that's partly the reason that, like, I don't care anymore, you know? After 1967, none of that matters, right?
Well, even my understanding is that Zionism as a movement was outlawed in the USSR as early as 1940, I want to say.
I know that they had specific laws about anti-Semitism on the books also, you know? I mean, not to talk about just, like, what's on the law books, but, like, it's literally illegal. I don't know what to tell you guys.
There are some weird little arguments that Losurdo makes, though, that... I don't know, feel a little tokenizing. Like he says on 216, in the course of the war in relation to its population, Jews earned more medals than any other Soviet nationality. It's like, okay. You know,
all right.
I don't know. That just feels like I've got a black friend kind of argument. Yeah, you know what I mean?
A little bit.
But anyway, nonetheless, I think it's an oversimplification to call Stalin an anti-Semite. And I also think if you're not in the same breath, I don't know why I'm going after Churchill so hard, but if you're not in the same breath also calling Churchill an anti-Semite, then you're doing the fucking CIA's work,
I mean,
brother.
God, man, even fucking Patton, right? Like, where's that quote where they're talking about Operation Unthinkable, basically? Right. General George S. Patton, he dreamed of immediate war against the Soviets. Quote, we're going to have to fight them sooner or later. Why not do it while our army is still intact and could kick the damn Russians back to Moscow in 3 months? We could easily do it ourselves with the help of the German troops we have. Jesus. If we just arm them and take them with us, they hate the bastards. Mm-hmm. You know, unfortunately, according to the American general, thwarting these plans were the Jews. Cool. Yeah. Also, like, if you want to talk about anti-Semitism, man, you got to talk about denazification. You got to talk about the fact that immediately following the destruction of the Third Reich, the construction of the Fourth Reich was started. We employed all of those Nazis.
I was going to say exactly that. Like, fucking NASA in the 50s is half Nazis.
It wasn't a decade later that West Germany was rearmed. A decade later.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Ain't history fun, y'all? Yeah, I will say, not... anti-kudos to Stalin for fucking doing the Nakba, essentially. That really sucks. I have been reading about the Nakba recently, and so it really does hurt my heart to see that, you know. To me, it's just incongruous with the whole, you know, everything that Losurdo says about how Lenin is finally destroying the rift between black and white civilizations. You know what I mean? It's not, it doesn't completely discount those things. That's not what I'm saying. But it's very interesting to have, for 20 years at that point, say, you know, the future lies in the colonized world, workers of the world unite, and then to essentially help exclude Arab people from their land.
Yeah.
For a white settler colonial population.
I think the Nakba is a clear stain on Stalin's legacy. And Losurdo, even, I think, doesn't really address it. He hand waves it away because he knows it's unconscionable.
Well, he leverages it. That's the thing, is that he's leveraging all of that support for Israel against the accusation of anti-Semitism to Stalin. So, you know, I don't think he would want to. I mean, he does say specifically that...
He ends that section by saying it should, however, be pointed out in this regard that the Soviet Union's preferred option was that of an independent multinational state that would respect the interests of both Jews and Arabs. And he kind of tries to reshape the anti-Semitism argument as not being anti-Semitic, but being anti-Arab. So there's like a different kind of racism in there, I guess, which I just that's not better, you know?
Yeah, it's just shit overall. Israel sucks. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm not sorry, actually. They're settlers, y'all.
Yeah. No good.
Yeah. So he starts this chapter here, Psychopathology, Morality, and History. He talks a little bit about the fifth column. And I know in the last episode, I said I wasn't really interested in talking about the fifth column because it felt racist. But I think that it's not that fifth column-ry is specifically new, but the term the fifth column actually originates in the Spanish Civil War. So it was a pretty new idea at the time. And Losurdo talks a lot about all the different situations in which people were expecting fifth columns, and it makes it a little better, but it's still not great. You know what I mean?
My commentary on this section has little to do with the history of Stalin and more about just this weaponization of the concept of sympathy, of being a sympathizer, and how all-encompassing a term like that becomes as a political tool when it's necessary to shoot down dissident groups. So on 241, we get this block quote. This is coming from Costello. Sympathize was the catch-all word that permitted the government to detain without trial indefinitely members not only of fascist organizations, but of any group that the Home Security judged sympathetic to the Germans, including those who advocated negotiations with Hitler. And there are a couple other quotes similar to that, like on 242. And as in England, also in the United States, the category of agent and enemy accomplice widens to include all those who would like to avoid the involvement or dragging of the country into the war. So you see how the language in the narrative shifts to a point that eventually they can detain anyone and everyone that they see fit simply for being a dissident, you know? And I bring up eco-terrorism all of the time on the show because it was a pivotal part in my political consciousness, my political awakening. But the creation of the term eco-terrorist became a way to weaponize a particular type of protest. And we see with ICE detentions happening now, with the people being kidnapped off the street by ICE, and now protesters protesting the kidnapping of people off the street, and how being a, quote, sympathizer is now a criminal offense. Being someone that protects others in your community is somehow now also a criminal offense. You just see how these terms get so broadened, so widened to become just a catch-all for anyone they don't want fucking causing a fuss. You know what I mean?
Dude, I mean, you can see it right now. I mean, you mentioned the ICE stuff, but shout out to Ken Klippenstein on Twitter. He's an investigative reporter. He gets a lot of leaks. I appreciate that. But he put out one of the memos about the NSPM-7 program, and it essentially identifies, I can't remember the specific word. I'm trying to look at it right now, but it's like NVE. It's something violent extremist, non-ideological violent extremist, something like that. And it's essentially just a big catch-all term for anybody they want to detain, you know?
Yeah, it's anybody, like Antifa.
Yeah, exactly. Except it's like on the fucking law books. You know, they could be like, oh, you're just a motivated violent extremist because you posted that meme of Charlie Kirk or something, and now you're fucking locked up.
Yeah.
You know, you see it happen right now.
Yeah. It's happening in real time in front of us for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, that fucking sucks.
Yeah, I just have a couple of random quotes from this section. I want to just point out on 247 that Freud, who was a fucking cokehead quack, but Freud, who died in 1939, thought it opportune to make a psychoanalytic study not on Stalin, and indeed not even on Hitler, but on Wilson, who was included in the list of those dangerous fanatics who are convinced that they have a special and personal relationship with divinity. That's just fucking hysterical to me. And why is it not immediately a disqualifying factor for someone to say that they talk to an invisible person? Like, how is that not just immediately like, oh, you're not a person to be trusted? I can't believe anything you say.
Man. I mean, you know, there's something interesting that Losurdo notes here where it's like, there's critiques of Stalin where they say he should have just shot Trotsky coming from the West. You know, it's a surprise that Stalin just didn't shoot Trotsky. Or like the Mensheviks. Like he says that unlike the Jacobins, the Bolsheviks didn't kill their Girondins. They let the Mensheviks go out into the world and they propped them up. I mean, that's what fucking Kerensky did. How typical is that you say, here, our former head of government that we've overthrown, why don't you just go into exile? There's nothing to say about that.
Well, I have a couple other things, but one thing that I have definitely taken from this book is a stronger sense that we need to be dog shitting on Churchill all the time, constantly.
Sure.
And I appreciate that Losurdo goes through some recapping of some of the terrible shit that Churchill did, specifically in Bengal, but also talks through England's time in Iraq. I don't know. I just don't think, I've said it already, and I just mean to reiterate it, I guess. I will not take a criticism of Stalin seriously unless it is also coming with the complete condemnation of Churchill and the British Empire. And if you, in the same breath, argue why Churchill should be absolved of his crimes while Stalin shouldn't, you're not a person to be taken seriously, and there's no fucking point.
Yeah, my favorite quote about this is actually comes from the Pol Pot discourse, and it's on 302.
Okay.
As it is well known, the barbarians are always outside the West, and if political leaders must be criminalized, it is only ever those responsible for the revolution and never for the war. And that's exactly what's happening here. Stalin is responsible for the revolution, never the war.
Yeah.
You know, we're allowed to criticize Hitler because he lost. Allowed, you know what I mean, though. Like, Hitler is easily criticizable because he's a big evil enemy that we've already beaten. Stalin started the revolution, right? He gets criticized. Churchill does the war. He does not. It's like history is written by the victors again.
Yeah, and it's like the Star Wars thing that you see online all the time. It's like, you think you're siding with the rebels, but you're siding with the Empire. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, Luke Skywalker would not be on Churchill's side.
Yeah, just to kind of invert what you were saying about, you know, saying if you're going to criticize Stalin in the same breath, you have to criticize Churchill and all that. But it's like, if you're willing to hand wave all of the horrors and atrocities, the straight line, as Losurdo says, from Locke to forced labor, then you should also be able to hand wave all of the atrocities, quote unquote, of communism.
Yeah.
You know, unless there's something else in this equation that you're not telling me about, perhaps maybe your ideological predilection for capitalism and empire and slavery and exploitation. Maybe that could be it.
Yeah. And, you know, another thing, this is kind of a pivot, but on 259, Losurdo gets to talking about Hiroshima.
Yeah.
And again, I'm such a history idiot. My understanding of Hiroshima coming into this reading was that the war was won before the bomb was dropped.
Over.
And I never really could understand or had any rational contextualization that made sense on why the bomb was dropped if that were the case, right? And Losurdo points out here on 259, or at least says that it had been pointed out. He uses the passive voice to avoid credit for it, I guess. It had been pointed out that the purpose of annihilating the civilian population of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not to push Japan closer to capitulation, but instead aimed more at the Soviet Union, to which a dire warning was being issued.
It's 100% true, man. I feel that in my heart.
Tens and tens of thousands of defenseless civilians of the old enemy are massacred in order to terrorize the ally already targeted as the new enemy and as a new target of the genocidal practices that had just been tested. And something just finally fucking clicked in my mind about that. And that's fucking gross. That's so atrocious.
Yeah. It's pretty damning.
Yeah.
I mean, even, you know, here's a more uncomfortable example, and I think it comes the page before. They're literally talking about fucking Bomber Harris, saying the Germans didn't expect to be bombed back, and then they did just as indiscriminate bombing campaigns on Germany. As we see it as Americans, we're like, yeah, fuck those guys, fuck those Nazis, right? But when you compare the attitudes of the British to the Soviets, looking at the block quote on 257, the Brits were happy to blow everything to bits. Mm-hmm. Stalin, or I guess this is in Dimitrov's diary, where he says, what is needed is for some Germans to appear who are capable of salvaging what can still be salvaged for the survival of the German people. Organize the municipalities, fix economic life, etc. on German territory, taken and occupied by the Red Army. Create local government agencies from which will come out a German government as well.
Yeah.
You know, it's just a totally different attitude. The Brits were happy to bomb them and leave it. You know, they were happy to blow it into bits. I mean, even the Morgenthau plan from the U.S., which I really appreciate, blow Germany up into 50 small little pre-industrial countries that will never, ever become Hitlerian again, or even Prussian again. Even that plan is like so vindictive. And it makes sense. I mean, I think, you know, rock and roll. Go ahead. But like, you can tell it's so vindictive. Like, they really want to cripple the German economy tremendously. Mm-hmm. You know, there's even a quote here where Losurdo says that Japan and Germany were saved by the start of the Cold War. The start of the Cold War prevented them from just becoming, I don't know, not colonial subjects, obviously, but they were rebuilt up. They were rearmed, reindustrialized. I mean, those were miracles that happened to their economy under the Truman Plan because we needed them to be a pillar in our Cold War structure.
Yeah, again, it comes back to this underlying argument that seems to be undergirding every part of this conversation. These are not decisions made by the Western empires out of scarcity. These are decisions made out of ideology. And there's a very distinct difference. It's very important.
Yeah.
He goes on from talking about Hiroshima to talking about Korea, which we already kind of pointed to. I have a quote.
Oh, here's the
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry this is so late, but on 264, there's the quote, "It's quite likely that without the abandonment of the NEP, the collectivization of agriculture with the stabilization of the flow of food, and industrialization in 4 stages, it would have been impossible to counter Hitler's aggression victoriously. Soviet Russia's unequaled and uncontested contribution to the defeat of Nazi Germany was closely bound up with Stalin's stubborn second revolution."
Thank you. Yeah. So that's in the context of talking about Stalingrad specifically, but that's exactly the quote I was looking for earlier. Thank you.
Yeah.
Here's something really interesting. There's some interesting commentary about race and integration in the United States and its connection to communism, or more specifically, its connection to anti-communist sentiment in the United States. This is all coming on 273. Mm-hmm. He's talking about in the U.S. South post-Civil War, about in the U.S. South, there is a new and worrying phenomenon of the growing impudence of young black folks. These, thanks to the communists, were in fact beginning to receive what the powers that be had stubbornly denied them. A culture that goes far beyond the elementary education traditionally given to those destined to provide semi-servile work in the service of the master race. Now, on the other hand, in schools organized by the Communist Party in the North, or in Moscow schools in Stalin's USSR, black citizens were busy studying economics, politics, world history. And he continues, a profound change took place in those who attended these schools. The impudence reproached to them by the white supremacy regime was in reality the self-esteem that had hitherto been hindered and trampled upon. And then he says at the bottom, the U.S. Secretary of Justice in 1952, in a letter, says he's debating the question of integration in public schools and gives this quote, "Racial discrimination furnishes grist for the communist propaganda mills, and it raises doubt even among friendly nations as to the intensity of our devotion to the democratic faith."
Yeah. I've heard before that whataboutism was coined by the CIA because there were so many examples of people being like, well, you know, America has slavery. That was like the common rebuttal from the Soviet Union, and you also lynch black people. You know, it's like, yeah, and you have like horrible KKK violence in the South.
Well, I just find that quote funny because it's like, don't talk about communism. It makes them want to integrate as a defense. Is just absurd. But there is certainly something there about the hypocrisy present in someone talking about ideals of freedom while being entrenched in Jim Crow policy, being a country founded on the genocide of indigenous people and the enslavement of stolen peoples. And I don't know, it also brings to mind, you know, you see those comparisons online sometimes about depictions of women in the USSR in the 50s versus the depictions of women in the United States in the 50s. Like, we got no fucking leg to stand on. The USSR wasn't perfect, and it's not any sort of suggestion that communism automatically eliminates racism and misogyny and shit like that, because those things are going to continue to live on, obviously. But there's a pretty clear difference in quality of life under these two ideologies, and it's silly. It's you're in a glass house, man. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, that's just always been the case, and the U.S. is aware of that. That's why they do all of this legwork to make us fucking. I mean, you know, that's where all the textbook stuff comes from. It comes from these exact things. You know, we gloss over all of the horrors of our history, and then we accentuate all the horrors of the rest of the world, especially the communist ones.
Yeah. And side note, this got me more and more pumped to read Black Marxism, the Cedric Robinson book. I've been thinking a lot about revolutionary movements in the United States and the potential for revolutionary organization in the United States. And historically, so much of progressive revolutionary action has fallen upon or been left to, out of ambivalence, black folks.
I texted you this earlier, but you should watch One Battle After Another.
Yeah.
Yeah, you should.
And I don't know, I'm just thinking about that. You know, like the 20th century, we've got figures like Fanon, we've got figures like Du Bois that are largely leading the charge with revolutionary literature coming out of the United States, you know what I mean? And that's a plight that we have, through, you know, white supremacist ambivalence, left to minorities to kind of take up, to hold up. And that, I don't know, I really want to read more about that. I really want to read Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism for the show.
I often am on a pendulum that swings between third worldism and something else. It's really tough for me to envision revolution in the global north as a whole. I mean, so many of the successful figures come from the global south. I'm thinking specifically of Mao and Ho Chi Minh, you know, Castro, Che Guevara. There's not a similar figure in the U.S. to any of those people. You know what I mean? A communist figure. I don't know who you would hold up in that same light.
Well, it would have been a figure like Hampton or Newton if they weren't killed, you
Right.
know.
But that's the point. We're still putting that off onto people of color. It's just in our own situation. There's not anyone in that same canon that's white. And I'm not saying that there needs to be. It's just, I think that it supports your argument. It's the fact that like so much of this legwork at the end of the day falls onto people of color,
Yeah. And I've been thinking about that, especially in the context around, the conversation around Renee Good's murder. And it's kind of like that seems to have woken up a number of white folks. And it's like, people are like, we've been saying this shit for decades.
Yeah.
It's
really bugging me right now because it's not that the big orgs aren't doing anything, PSL, FRSO, DSA, all of those guys. But I'm starting to get the sense that most of the communist work in this country is actually done by groups that we have no idea about. Small mutual aid networks, local groups that are probably organized by people of color. And we don't hear about them at all. They probably move in silence most of the time. And I think it's kind of a real disservice that the big groups that we have are groups like PSL and FRSO. I don't know, man. I've been really feeling iffy about local orgs, not local orgs, but like our national organizations recently.
Yeah.
And I think that part of it is just the kind of dire situation we're in. Now would be the perfect time for that kind of serious movement building to
mass mobilization
to like hugely accelerate, But aside from like the occasional Instagram post that I see from PSL, it's not that much. And I'm not saying they're not doing anything. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm sure that they're mobilized all over the country to do as much as they think they can, but it doesn't feel like much.
Yeah, that's been the tension that we've explored on 41 episodes of the show up until this point. You need a mass organization in order to be strong enough to build the movement, but with that mass organization comes all of this sanitization, I guess. In order to appeal to a broader mass, they're not actually holding the line on revolutionary rhetoric, and or those folks that would hold that line get disillusioned with the larger party and they split and they make their small local organization that can do something in their community, but that's never going to be enough to do more than that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just a constant tension.
Yeah, it's really frustrating. And I mean, I don't know, it's the design of the climate that we're in, I'm sure, as well. I've just become more increasingly distrustful of the big orgs that I was previously seeing in a brighter light.
Yeah.
And I don't know why. I don't know whether it's because they seem ineffectual in their messaging, in their movements. Maybe I'm just not seeing the big picture, but the U.S. is in a dire place right now, guys. I really don't want to do end of the world doomerism here, because I don't think that's the case. I don't even feel that way about the climate. It's not like you're going to flip a switch and the world's going to explode, but it's just going to keep getting worse and worse and worse. And I don't want to be like, do something, but like, God, man, It's especially just being a guy in the middle of nowhere, working 2 jobs. I don't have the time or the energy. It's really challenging right now. How do I go work a fucking job? And we are entering into a civil war. We are occupying our own states with our fucking slave catcher Gestapo force.
I don't have anything reassuring to tell you, that's for sure.
Listener, you can let us know how you feel. leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Yeah, please. Okay, let's jump to 7 and 8, I guess.
Yeah.
Again, I don't have a whole lot from these last chapters. I know we're going to get caught in some
I know we're going to talk about Pol Pot, man.
Before that, can I point out the second typo I found in this book?
By all means.
On page 295.
2 episodes, 2 typos.
The opposing military cliques were sometimes supported by this or that foreign power. Do better, Iskra Books. Well, I've pointed it out for you. So if someone from Iskra is listening, or if you could get this to someone from Iskra, make sure they fix these 2 typos for the next edition.
Yeah. Chapter 7 does start with that, what I was referencing earlier. Unlike the Jacobins, the Bolsheviks did not execute their Girondists. That is, the Mensheviks, who were authorized and even encouraged to leave Russia and establish their political center abroad. Right, in the block quote below, Stalin expressed himself thus more than once. In 1929, he made up his mind to exile Trotsky. It was inconceivable that Trotsky should be imprisoned, let alone put before a firing squad.
Yeah.
And again, this is Stalin's primary opponent. If he was truly a evil, menace, power-seeking authoritarian, he would just kill him.
And I think there are plenty of people that would say that tactically that would have been the right move to make.
It probably would have been.
Yeah.
He should have shot those people. He didn't shoot enough people. That's what we're saying. No.
I mean, kind of.
If we ever, dude, it's so funny. Like, there is a Stalinist rabbit hole out there, and there's a point at which it gets super crazy. Like, I haven't read any Grover Fur, but there's a guy named Grover Fur who writes all of these. Like, he has a lecture where he's like, people keep asking me about the crimes of Stalin, and I keep looking for them. You know, like, I can't seem to find any. It's like the only crime Stalin did is that he didn't go far enough.
Yeah.
You know, I'm somewhere on the Stalinist spectrum, but I ain't there.
Yeah, I'm not quite there. I'm probably slightly closer than you are.
Oh, how the tables have turned, Aaron.
I know, right? One thing that jumped out to me was on 296.
Okay.
He gets us shifting to talking about Mao a little bit here.
Yeah.
He says, this tragic history behind the revolution vanishes in the historiography and publicity revolving around the negative hero cult. As in Russia, in China, it is the revolution led by the Communist Party that ultimately saved the nation and even the state. But the record of horror blamed on the Chinese communist leader is achieved by placing the victims of famine and starvation that plagued China on his account.
Yeah, before we go on to the Pol Pot stuff, what he's setting up here is just the way that, like, they do character assassination on all of these leaders, and that's always been the case.
Yeah,
on
why change the playbook?
Yeah, on 288 and 289, I mean, you can see it goes as far back, right? He talks about the moral decapitation of Robespierre. He talks about Bela Kun in the Hungarian Socialist Republic, which, side note, I've heard that maybe he was awful, like maybe he was absolutely terrible, but it's very funny to see. I'm just looking on 291, right? The Hungarian communist leader Bela Kun is accused of having set up a splendidly supplied harem where he, the perverse and insatiable Jew, could rape and defile honorable Christian virgins by the dozen. Calling attention to this infamy was a newspaper which was later to become the organ of the Nazi party. You know, so like this kind of character assassination has always been present, you know, and it's just a question of how far you want to take that. Losurdo will take it all the way, as you will see.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Just to close that,
Yeah.
On 299, I think there's this great quote. The ruling group that ended the century of humiliation becomes a hodgepodge of criminals, while those responsible for the immense tragedy of a century, and those who, through the embargo, did everything they could to prolong it, are set up as the champions of freedom and civilization.
Right.
We have seen Goebbels in 1929 branding Trotsky as the one who perhaps can be considered the greatest criminal of all time. That's just a lull at the end. But this complete rebranding to like control the narrative of history by calling the people that were fighting against the predominant powers the real villains, and the predominant powers that are actually responsible for the most death, misery, debauchery of the century are somehow the figureheads leading freedom and civilization.
And it's always sexual, too. Like, what's up with that? I remember reading in Lovell. It's a book about Maoism that I read last year, and it's not communist at all. In fact, it's quite critical. But it somehow made me more sympathetic to both Mao and modern China and global Maoist movements, which I thought was really funny. But she quotes a biography of Mao, which comes from his doctor, and it's been widely criticized for a lot of reasons. But in it, he says that, like, you know, Mao would say that he would cleanse himself with virgins, you know, by sleeping with virgins, stuff like that. And it's like, it's always sexual for some reason, you know? Yeah. It's always about purity or some shit. I mean, just an interesting note there.
Yeah. Well, I suppose we've prolonged it as long as we're going to. We need to talk about the Pol Pot stuff here.
It's as simple as this, okay? No Vietnam War, no Pol Pot. Why do we criticize Pol Pot and not in the same breath criticize Kissinger and Nixon?
Yeah. I will admit, and I texted you at the time when we were reading this 2 months ago, that, like, I fundamentally agree with Losurdo's conclusion.
Yeah.
But I'm just really uncomfortable with anything that feels like apologetics for Pol Pot.
I totally understand, man.
I'm not in any way a defender of Pol Pot, but the situation that put Pol Pot in power is not to be blamed on communism. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's necessary to have a materialist lens when looking at Pol Pot's situation. I don't know. Listen to Blowback. I'll 2 times in one episode. Yep. The season on Cambodia is heartbreaking. It's really a real struggle. You know, and the thing is that I think the only defense of Pol Pot that you need is the fact that we dropped 24 times more tonnage of bombs on Cambodia than we did on Japan. We obliterated 90 to 95% of their standing buildings. Okay? We led a secret illegal war on them for 10 years. We overthrew their leaders and put dictators in power. Can you be shocked that the most violent outcome happened?
No.
That's it.
Yeah. I mean, the amount of bombs that we dropped on Cambodia, over 750,000 Cambodian peasants died because of what Nixon and Kissinger did. Not even talking about Agent Orange yet. And you're right, it feels a little reductive, but the equation no Vietnam War, no Khmer Rouge is simplistic, but it reflects an undeniable truth.
You know,
That's it.
Pol Pot was formed by the fact that they were being obliterated. Pol Pot originally studied, I believe, in France, if I'm not mistaken. He was under the PCF, the French Communist Party, maybe? Something along those lines. But he studied under, like, real communist schools. You know, he didn't get some kind of crackpot ideology. It's the fact that he took those teachings and went back to Cambodia and then witnessed the destruction of his people that formed him into Pol Pot, that formed the Khmer Rouge from a regular communist party to the kind of insane xenophobic insurgency that they became, which, mind you, they were supported by the U.S. for the last 20 years of their reign, okay? They were put out of power by the Vietnamese. Right? I don't want to fucking talk about Pol Pot if you're not going to talk about that as well. It's that they were a convenient tool for us, the U.S. Suddenly they weren't some evil fucking thing. We kept their UN seat for 10 years. Pol Pot died of natural causes.
Yeah, Losurdo on 302 has that quote. It should be added that after the conquest of power during the subsequent conflict with Vietnam, Pol Pot was supported politically and diplomatically by the U.S., and yet the dominant ideology passes over in silence the principal and decisive role of Nixon and Kissinger in the Cambodian tragedy.
Yeah, exactly. The political leaders must be criminalized. It is only ever those responsible for the revolution, never for the war.
Yeah, so again, how can you cast a moral judgment on Pol Pot that is in any way harsher than that on Nixon or Kissinger? The answer is condemn them all.
Yeah, yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
And again, just like I had said last time, emptying the cities, I don't think is inherently communistic. I don't. Pol Pot took the policy to the Chinese, and the Chinese said, shit, man, we would never be able to do something like that. That's wild. And then Mao died.
Yeah, so...
Yeah, we're not apologizing for Pol Pot in the slightest. Go listen to Blowback. That's my recommendation there.
It's funny, I laughed when you said that, because that's exactly what your response was to me when I texted you about the Pol... I was like... He's kind of veering into Pol Pot apologetics here, and you're.
I was actively listening to the Cambodia season that when we were talking about that, so I had it on the mind because it's brutal, guys. It's really brutal. Okay,
heinous shit.
I saw a headline the other day that they were doing sewer maintenance in Laos and found a fucking unexploded artillery shell that was in there. You know, there's still like. I don't have a specific number, but something ridiculous, like 80,000 tons of unexploded American ordnance in Laos.
Yeah.
And that's crazy. Shout out to Laos. They're still nominally communist.
Yeah, shout out. Anything else before we head into the cavalcade?
I think that's it, man.
I think so, too. I think let's go to the cavalcade of quotes.
Yeah. I don't know. There is something interesting that he starts right off with, and it's the idea of the pan-nationalist movements. I think there's something interesting about pan-nationalism that goes alongside our conversation of the role of nationalism as well. There's something that's always really exciting to me about Pan-Africanism, Pan-Arabism, Pan-Asianism, those kinds of things. When you move into Pan-Slavism, it gets a little weirder. Pan-Germanism is obviously for the Nazis.
Yeah, not good.
But there's that question, right, of where's the role of the nation? Where's the role of an ethnic identity? If you want to expand it past the nation to a total ethnic group, a pan-nationalist group, then I think that there are interesting ideas there. And just as the role of nationalism is not quite resolved in history, I think that the role of pan-nationalism is also not quite resolved. Perhaps the failures of the historical pan-nationalist movements were because the regular nationalist movements hadn't quite wrapped up yet. We weren't necessarily at the end of the nationalist movement to then expand out to the pan-nationalist movement. I don't know, just something I had in mind because it's interesting. I have a positive look on pan-Arabism, pan-Africanism, and even pan-Slavism to an extent, but clearly not pan-Germanism.
Yeah, the national question is certainly something that I've had on my mind, and we've talked about it at length, and I still haven't quite resolved. I think I've become more skeptical of it in time in the context of a national character of revolution happening in the United States or on North America.
Dude.
Because I just don't think, I'm becoming less and less convinced that it's possible to separate a national identity from a white supremacist identity on this continent.
I've got it. Fuck America. Let's do state nationalism.
Buckeyes.
We're Ohioans. Don't fucking forget it. Don't you talk to me, Michigander. Fucking
They'd
silence.
be the first ones.
I know they would. I know they would. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to reinvent the nation on a smaller scale. Maybe that's the solution. Maybe we do need to differentiate ourselves from the other states more and more. And then we can create a positive national identity for our small nation. This is a terrible idea. What am I No, obviously this is not right.
Did you have a quote for the cavalcade with that?
No.
It sounded like you were ramping up for one.
It was just the first thing on my notes list, and I was like, damn, I did write that down there. Because he says on 173, I do have a quote, in fact.
Okay.
We look with amusement when reading in Arendt that what characterizes the pan movements is an absolute claim to chosenness. Yet celebration of the United States as God's chosen people runs deep through the American political tradition and continues to resonate to this day in the speeches of U.S. presidents.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I've been reading about the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Nixon Land, Invisible Bridge, and Reagan Land, which are all fantastic books I highly recommend. And something that's so clear in a lot of those old political speeches is Manifest Destiny, the description of America as the nation between two seas. You know, it's like there's nothing inherent about America that says that. It's only our idea as this kind of expansionist project.
Yeah.
You know, and like it's totally woven into our history. And in the same way, the U.S. is a divine project. We don't see it as much these days, although you're starting to see it more and more from our current frothing administration. But you really, you know, you don't have to go that far back to start seeing that kind of stuff. I mean, God, even in the Iraq War, there's that really funny Mother Jones article about George Bush calling the French president and saying that the forces of Gog and Magog are at war in the Middle East and we must bring our divine retribution or something like that because he heard that he was a Catholic or something, you know, and it's like this stuff is still at play.
Yeah, the claim to chosenness did stand out to me in that quote. There's another one that just sprung to mind on 180. Losurdo is talking about Nazi Protestants.
Yeah.
As for the Protestant world, it must not be forgotten that the Deutsche Christen, sorry, Germany.
I'm not sorry.
Sided with Hitler immediately after his coming to power and took up that position by adapting Christianity to the needs of the Third Reich, reinterpreting the Protestant Reformation in a nationalistic and even racist key in order to theorize a church fused with the German popular community and founded on the recognition of the diversity of peoples and races as an order willed by God. And I just couldn't stop thinking about modern evangelicalism and the complete... I mean, I'm an atheist, that's well known. I think all that stuff is dumb shit. But the complete bastardization of at least the New Testament and the Bible to somehow align with this kind of fascist bullshit that's happening now.
Nothing new, man. I always think of the slave Bible, you know?
Exactly. Like, and fucking...
I mean...
This is not a novel idea. Jesus was a brown Palestinian communist, man. And to turn that guy into some sort of beacon of this modern fascist bullshit malarkey is just... How can anyone reconcile those two thoughts in their own mind? The dissonance is astounding.
Yeah. I have some incendiary feelings here, but I don't know if they're for the podcast. You know, it's that Christ has always been a crusader. Sorry, I hate to be that way, but I won't elaborate.
Fair enough.
You know, but I mean, but even to talk about in a more in the time period, right? Losurdo talks about the fact that the Vatican basically outright supported Hitler and Mussolini. I mean, what was that? Pope Leo the 9th or the 10th?
I don't know.
I don't. Yeah. That's Hoy history. Sorry, I only know maybe of that because of Hoy, but he does mention specifically the Holy See in here.
Okay.
Yeah. So no, I'm totally with you.
Random quote on 189. This is Hitler talking. He says, "These beasts and wild animals," clearly included Stalin, who on another occasion was seen by Hitler as being coming from the underworld, confirming the satanic character of Bolshevism. And to that I say, fuck yeah, dope.
Yeah, sick as hell.
Yeah.
I mean, shoot, but not only tangentially related, but it really shocking to me that Untermensch actually comes from English.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It was coined by somebody in English. I don't remember who. I didn't write down the name. But, you know, just another example of the fact that Hitler was inspired by America, guys. Don't forget, Hitler did not predate America. That was the opposite. Oh, man. I forgot about the flight of Rudolf Hess, man. Just to double back on that idea of, like, two Aryan empires. I mean, that's what Rudolf Hess's flight was all about. Do you know about that? Mm-mm. Rudolf Hess was, like, Hitler's third in command or something along those lines. I don't remember exactly. I don't give a shit about the Nazi high command. And right after France surrendered, Rudolf Hess flew across the English Channel and landed in London and said, "Stop fighting Germany. We need to join together and fight the Soviets." And he was arrested immediately. But, the point is that, there was some hope there, guys. He did not do it on the wishes of Hitler, by the way. It was a secret flight. He fled. On 198, there's that quote where he says, it could be said that what saved the Germans and the Japanese or significantly shortened their suffering was the outbreak of the Cold War. In the struggle against the new enemy, they could prove valuable as cannon fodder, and their experience could be utilized by their former adversary. I mean, Allen Dulles, literally, he was not our Secretary of State. That was his brother, John Foster Dulles, but he was the CIA director for a long while, was a quintessential part of the creation of the rat lines in Switzerland to funnel Nazis out of the crumbling Third Reich and into America. Okay? That was at the top of our fucking mind. We said almost immediately, how can we get these Nazis in charge? How can we get these Nazis into power? There are some funny bits about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion on page 204. Something shocking is that Her Majesty's official printers provided the printing for the English edition. Really wild. Do you know anything about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion?
No.
It's a racist tract that...
that's a given. Yeah.
Yes. It's totally made up. I think it was made by the Nazis. Actually, I don't know that for sure. Asterisk. But it talks about how the Elders of Zion have a secret meeting where they boil children and drink their blood and shit like that.
Oh,
it's like
Pizzagate.
Yeah, it's like the foundations of all of those blood libel rumors and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's been obviously very clearly shown as something created and propagandistic and totally fabricated, of course, but it has been around for a long, long time, and it's still an issue. There's a book I would see sometimes called On a Pale Horse, and it's really funny because it's full of conspiracy theories, but there's 2 editions. And in the second edition, there's a little note that's like, if the lieutenant colonel had known that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion were totally fabricated, he never would have included them in the first edition. I don't know. It's just really funny to me anytime they get brought up because it's such a ridiculous thing, but it's like, it has super serious historical consequences.
I have a couple quotes here that I'd like to string together from deep in the book. This is on 321. This comes from Losurdo talking about the kind of betrayal narrative.
Yeah.
And he's bringing in some discussion about the liberal West and the founding of the United States. He says, is today's Islamic fundamentalism also a, quote, degeneration with respect to the Quran and the doctrine of Muhammad? Consistent with this approach, those who want to can consider the enslavement and annihilation of colonial peoples implemented by the liberal West a degeneration of liberalism, and thus the traitors would be Washington, Jefferson, Madison, all slave owners, or Franklin, according to whom it is one of the designs of Providence that these savages, the Native Americans, are exterminated in order to make room for the cultivators of the land. And then likewise, on 323, because he's kind of threading together this narrative that the philosophy that inspired the Founding Fathers obviously was inherently flawed. And he says on 323, if the path from Marx to Stalin and the Gulag is problematic, bumpy, and in any case mediated by completely unpredictable events such as the World Wars and the permanent state of exception, the line connecting Locke, that's John Locke, to the slave trade, or Mill, John Stuart Mill, or Tocqueville, Alec de Tocqueville, to forced labor imposed on the natives in the colonial massacres is immediately discernible. Yeah. You can't fucking have it both ways. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know. I just really appreciated how clearly he delineates that argument. It can't be both. You can't be a harbinger of freedom and a slave owner. You can't...
Side note, do you own Settlers? Did I tell you to get Settlers by Jay Sakai?
No.
I really want to read Settlers this year.
Okay.
The subtitle is The Myth of the White Proletariat, and it's a bit of a meme online, but I do want to read it.
Dope. Let's do it.
Yeah, it's a lot about that kind of thing, like the founding fathers of America, the counter-revolution of 1776, so to speak. I would like to read it. I don't know. We'll see.
Okay.
We'll take a look at it. I do just want to make note on 245. He says, more than 20 years after Stalin's death, the picture does not change. This can be deduced from the article in a prestigious U.S. newspaper. No citation, by the way, so how prestigious, really. The author smugly reports how a CIA campaign of computer sabotage culminating in 1974 in a huge explosion in Siberia, all organized by a mild-mannered economist named Gus Weiss, helped the United States win the Cold War. We were at war with the Soviet Union for their entire time. There was no point where they were not under siege by our forces. It's just really clear.
It's that state of exception argument all over again.
Yeah.
Yeah. The last thing I would point to, and I know I'm going to have a hard time articulating my thoughts on it, but it's near the end. It's on 324 onto 325, and it's pretty long. It is too convenient to put the infamies of Nazism on Hitler alone, removing the fact that he took from the world that existed before him, radicalizing what he found the two central elements of his ideology, the celebration of the colonizing mission of the white race in the West, now called upon to extend their domination into Eastern Europe as well, and the reading of the October Revolution as a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy which, by stimulating the revolt of the colonial peoples and undermining the natural hierarchy of races, and more generally by infecting like a pathogen the organism of society, constituted a frightening threat to civilization to be confronted by all means, including the final solution. And that just really stood out to me because I think it is far too convenient to pin all of the crimes of Nazi Germany on Hitler, because it is based on, he is inspired by the crimes of the United States. And it's also problematic to do that because the death of Nazism doesn't necessarily die with the death of Hitler. You know what I mean? As is quite
Clearly
fucking
not.
clear.
Yeah.
And I just think it's too convenient, and we're too conditioned to accept simple narratives like that, it's just something we got to be on guard for. I don't know. It didn't start with Hitler and it didn't end with Hitler. And it's important for us to keep that in mind in the modern day.
Someone should write a revisionist history of World War II with no Germany in the central. You know, they should just do the history of World War II through the lens of the aggression against the Comintern. I mean, because like Hitler springs up in the middle of that. And it's not that Hitler isn't important. It's just, there's just such a bigger picture in the world outside of Hitler that it's just that Hitler is such a statement point, you know? Oh, that's Hitler. It's all Hitler. He was just a big flash in the pan.
Yeah.
But it's just a symptom of the same kind of capitalist. It's like the culmination of essentially the liberal capitalist project up until that point. I don't know if that's a fully fleshed out idea, but there's something there.
Yeah. Well, that was it.
We did it.
What questions are you left with?
I don't know. My only real question was about how important is it to prevent someone from Stalin from being in power when he's senile. I don't really have any other questions aside from that.
I mean, what's so funny about that is just that Stalin, as the whatever fucking general secretary or whatever of the party, I know 4 times he tried to resign. Like,
well, dude, it's the same thing as Roosevelt being elected a 4th time and then dying. That should never have happened anyway, but it did because of the state of exception.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's not as crazy. But the thing is that the exception was there and it caused that shift. You know what I mean? Like, the question is this, right? How far really is a state of exception allowed to push you? Like how...
Yeah, that's good.
For how long is that excusable? Like I said in the last one, right? Is a state of exception something strong enough to allow the Leninist oligarchical structure of the state to be dissolved? To make Stalin an autocrat? Is that what the structure should allow to happen? I don't necessarily agree. In this case, in this specific situation, Stalin beat Hitler. Like they were doing a fist fight. It worked out in the end of the day, but like it's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, our description of the state of exception in the first episode was that it's an explanation, not a justification, right? Or not, not an absolvement, So there's something really intriguing there to that question. Like, what is the line where it no longer even is acceptable as an explanation,
Yeah. The exception is to something, right? It's to the norm.
Realistically, every communist project is going to be in a state of exception until global communism is achieved.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so like there has to be a delineated line where certain things are not acceptable even in that context.
Well, hold on though, because this is it. It's just dialectical. There's a difference between the ideal and the practice. Mm-hmm. Stalin's continued attempts to move out of the state of exception. I mean, that's what built history. You know what I mean?
That's true.
It's just a matter of doing it and succeeding. Sorry.
Just do it.
Just do the gulag right.
Yeah.
Execute another guy, and this time you'll do it.
Just gulag better.
Yeah, more gulag.
Okay.
All right. Okay. What questions did you have?
My questions are all about the history. I have so many blind spots, and I guess it was a disappointment for me that the situation around Ukraine was not addressed in the way that I would have wanted it to be.
Yeah.
Again, like he mentions the kulaks like once, and I just that's astounding to me. I know it's not a book about Ukraine, but you know what I mean. So my questions are still really around that. I still want to know more around the history around that. I don't know a lot about the history of Operation Barbarossa. You know what I mean? Like I have such a surface level knowledge of so much of the history around World War II. I don't want to become a middle-aged dude that just reads World War II books all the time.
Yeah.
But I do want to know more. My questions are all about that stuff,
I'm getting there, man. I really am, dude. I sent you that clip from the Kotkin interview, and then you were like, oh, I should check that book out. And it's like, it's a 3-part biography.
Yeah, never mind.
Yeah. But I'm like, damn, 3 parts.
Maybe I should, yeah.
Yeah. Shit.
No, I mean, I guess I do have kind of a question, a broader question in this kind of spirit, which is how to avoid this kind of trap of the great man. That's basically the same question that you have. How do you avoid allowing the leader of the party to become an autocrat? But like,
I think you just do it, man. Like, I hate to be that way, but like,
what is the mechanism that is in place that's going to stop that from happening? And I know the anarchists are shouting at us what they believe the answer to be.
Yeah, dissolve the state.
And that's not a satisfactory answer to me yet. So I don't know. There's still a question floating in my mind around that.
Well, that's the thing about the exception, is that it's based on the rules. That's what I was trying to say earlier. So if the rules are written in a way that the breakage in the rules requires something so insane, such as a Stalin figure, to then be the exceptional outcome, the exceptional factor, then maybe there's something wrong with the rules. You know what I mean? But the thing is that you're never going to get that out of the ideal. You're only going to ever get that out of the practical, or out of the unity between the two, perhaps.
The synthesis.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't talk about it, but they go over the Constitution, the USSR Constitution. And I think it is very likely that any sort of revolutionary project is going to have something like a constitution that they want to write. And that's all well and good, but it requires enforcement.
Yep.
And where is the mechanism for enforcement that does not also become an allowance for autocratic figures? You know, I don't know. That sounds like a slippery slope, and I don't mean to fall into that trap, but
I wouldn't even feel so bad about it, though, because I'm thinking about the anarchist side of things. It's the same kind of slope. There's no explicit mechanism in the anarchist structure that prevents that from happening, aside from the fact that everybody agrees not to do it. That's the same thing that we're doing. It's just that there's a more codified set of rules that then allows for an exception.
We're doing it with an army.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know.
I would read this book if you want a very broad, positive view of Stalin. That's kind of a general thing to say, but that's really the best I got, you know? I think that this book does a really good job of contextualizing a lot of Stalin's actions in a way which you may not have considered before. Even if you have considered them, then I think it fleshes them out. I think at some points, I'm not going to lie, I think it's a little slapshod. You know, like it's a wide variety of sources, of which many I did not follow up on. It feels very weird sometimes. And also, this is because it's translated from Italian, but man, I can't stand the way he writes sometimes. I was like, get over it, dude. Get to the fucking point.
Yeah.
But I liked it.
I don't mean to be a troll.
Yeah.
But I would read this book if I were a trot. I do think it's important for us to analyze critical text about leading figures of the movement, whether we're behind them or not. I don't know that this did a lot to change my opinion of Stalin. I think I came into the reading with a more positive than negative attitude towards Stalin, and I've left the reading with a more positive than negative view of Stalin.
See, but the thing is that if you hold a negative attitude of Stalin in your heart already, I don't know how much this will change your mind. You know what I mean? Because it seems almost glib. This is exactly what Losurdo does with the Holodomor argument, is that he very quickly says, look at all of these other contemporary things that are happening that are just as bad. That disqualifies the fact that it happened at all. And
the terror famine.
Yeah, and then he moves on and says, you know, here's how I'm going to spin off from that. You know, he doesn't do anything to actually discredit that notion. And that's not necessarily the case. I mean, in the Holodomor example, no. But there's something about Losurdo's tone in this book that I think if you already had a particularly negative image of Stalin, you would not appreciate. That's what I'm getting at here.
I think that's probably true.
Yeah, I think you'd be like, man, this guy really loves riding Stalin's dick. And anything that Stalin did, he would find a way to justify.
Big glazer, Stalin. Yeah. Yeah, okay, that's fair. Okay.
What are we reading next?
Next, we're reading Caliban and the Witch.
Yeah, by Silvia Federici.
Yeah. Very excited.
I've already started it, guys.
Yeah, I'm 140 pages in.
It's been great. I don't know what to say about it.
I'm really looking forward to it. I think, as has been no secret on the show, I am always keen. I think we are both always keen to see the synthesis of other forms of revolutionary politic play with Marxism, and I'm really excited. I was really excited to get the book and a few of others of hers because I'm really excited to see some more explicitly Marxist feminist interpretation.
Yeah.
And so far it hasn't disappointed. I'm really looking forward to finishing it and talking about it.
Yeah, I've been having a thrill with the history. Chris is also reading it. She's ahead of me. She's been enjoying it too,
Dope.
which is certainly a gold star. That being said, if you had any strong feelings about this book or this episode, or if you had other recommendations for us to read, both pro and anti-Stalin, feel free to let us know at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. We love hearing from you.
Absolutely, and grab your copy of Caliban and the Witch for the next episode.
Don't get left unread.
That's right. Bye-bye.
See ya.